Hello and welcome to Kyurukyurun. This is a series of videos where we go over all of the teams in WIXOSS Diva format at a high level just to give you an idea in terms of the team's play styles and strengths and weaknesses so that if you're new to the game and you are curious of what the team plays like, if you're new to the team, maybe this is the team that just came out in the newest set. If you want to give them a try and you aren't sure how they go, then this is the series for you. Kyurukyurun has the distinction of being the final team released in Diva format. Not to say there won't be any in the future, but just knowing what we know about the Japanese format and how far they are ahead of us, there are no other teams that have come out since their release. I've thought about making a video for dream teams and constructing your own dream team, so if that is something you're interested in, then definitely let me know about that, and I may invest some time into a video outlining that as well. Kyurukyurun is a team that is very heavily interactive with their opponent. There are a lot of cards that they have that will force your opponents to make decisions, either to draw or discard cards or something like that. Most importantly, they have a team denial piece that is very impactful in the meta if you are running a non-dream, if you're running an actual Diva team. That's something that can really get in your way, which we will get to in a moment. But basically, Kyurukyurun in general is all about trying to mess up all of your opponent's plans as much as possible, then outlast them and outvalue them and get into the late game and basically just overrun them with as much value as you can generate. As always, when we look at the teams, we will first look at their piece, and their piece is a spicy one. I am of the opinion that if this team came out early, especially in the early stages of Diva format, it would be oppressive and potentially banned for how strong it is, but we've reached the point now where it's not too bad just because you have a lot of other team options. Basically, the piece is actually unique. It has a timing that it can be used as a cut-in when an opponent uses a team piece, which is very unique. Usually pieces are either main phase, attack phase, both, but this can actually be used as a piece cut-in. Most importantly, because the first effect that it has is to counter the effects of target piece in the check zone with the use condition team. So essentially what this means is if you are running a team piece of any kind, especially if you're in a team that very heavily relies on that, Card Jockey, Ancient Surprise in particular, those two teams, pretty heavily reliant on their team pieces. This piece completely shuts it down. It basically says, I know you built your deck around this piece, but I'm not going to allow you to play it. If you are in a situation where you're running Kyurukyurun against maybe a dream team or a team that's not running its team piece, which is possible, although somewhat unlikely, there's a second mode that will allow you to draw a card and enter charge 1, which is actually the exact same text as the piece Kyurukyurun. I cannot pronounce it, but there's a piece that came out in P00 that is that exact effect. So you can fall back on that. It's not a terrible effect, drawing card, enter charge 1. You know, it's good resource, but the main reason you play Kyurukyurun is just for the sake of countering team pieces. And again, just because, especially in the early days of Diva format, how heavily reliant teams were on their team piece, the fact that they have access to a team piece that literally shuts down all team pieces in the game is extremely strong. One thing I will mention here that this is specific for team pieces. So once we get dream team pieces in the next upcoming set, this are not affected by this card. So you can actually use your dream team pieces as much as you want, and they're not affected. It only specifically references team specific pieces. So there is a distinction there as well. Looking now at the center Elrigs, Mikomiko is the only one we have access to at the moment. She recently came out in Curiosity Diva. She has an auto effect that whenever she attacks, if your opponent has 3 or less cards in their hand, you get to draw. If they have 4 or more cards, then your opponent has to discard. So it's all about hand management, depending on game state, specifically how many cards your opponent has. You're either going to continue to accumulate your resources or you're going to start denying their resources. She has an enter effect to draw 2 cards unless your opponent discards a card. So like I mentioned, this is one of the your opponent chooses effects. Basically, it's going to get you plus card advantage in some meaningful way, either through drawing 2 or your opponent discarding 1. In a perfect world, you'd want to draw 2, I would imagine, but there can be situations where your opponent may be discarding a card that they might especially need, something like that. There is a 1 per game action. You can look at your opponent's hand, choose a card, and remove it from the game. Obviously, this is very strong. It's especially different from discarding because there are things that can trigger when they get discarded, and obviously if something does get discarded, it will go into the trash, but this excludes it from the game entirely. So if the deck does refresh, if your opponent has potentially cards that you can bring things back from the graveyard. This bypasses all of them. And it's also very important too that you are the one specifically choosing the card that your opponent gets rid of. So you can remove a guard if they have a really powerful Signee that you're anticipating coming at you on the following turn. You can remove that before it becomes a problem. So overall, a lot of really good things. Very focused on sort of hand management and card advantage, resource denial type stuff. So not a bad level 3 overall. I would be remiss here if I didn't mention the other Center L rigs. These are not out yet. This one, Maho Maho, will be coming back in P07, so not the next set, but the one after it. But I figure for the sake of completion, we will discuss what options she has, just so we can, again, go over all of the aspects of the team. And then, once these start coming out, you'll have access to some strategies with that. So her card text, she has an auto effect. At the beginning of your attack phase, your opponent chooses one of the following, and you, the Maho Maho player, do it. The first option is to put the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck into their trash, and the second option is to add a target Signee from your trash to your hand. So basically, whenever you start to attack with Maho Maho, your opponent will choose to either essentially mill 4 cards of their own deck or allow you to choose a Signee from your trash and return it to your hand. So both of those things are extremely powerful. Again, it's sort of counterbalanced by the fact that your opponent is choosing, and a common trend with Kyurukyurun in general is that there are a lot of these opponent choose effects, and it's not the kind of thing, especially at very high level competition. You typically don't want those effects because you're always going to get the worst version of it. So usually it needs to be a situation where both effects are extremely powerful in order for you to get real benefit out of it. So this one's really not bad. The fact that you can potentially pulling Signee back to your hand every turn is pretty good. But again, it happens at the attack phase, so it's not like you can play it this turn. You'd have to, wait. But this is potentially an option to continuously recur guards if your opponent is choosing that every time. Otherwise, they're milling 4, which can potentially bring them closer to a refresh and cause, a destruction of life cloth in that way. So that's an auto effect. She does have an enter effect to put target Signee from your trash onto your field. So that's some Signee recursion, a little bit of card advantage as well. You get to reuse some of your previous Signee. Probably the best way to use this is to have maybe a powerful level 3 that you've used for enter earlier on in the game, and then you can just pull it out of your back pocket as soon as you grow. And she does have a once per game action to do the following 3 times. The action is your opponent puts the top 4 cards of their deck into their trash unless they pay 1 colorless or discard a card. So there are 3 instances. Your opponent can choose to either pay a colorless, discard a card, or lose the top 4 cards of their deck. And they have to do that 3 different times. So they can pay 3 enter, they can discard 3 cards, they can just mill a clean 12, or any combination thereof, and do it that way. So you'll notice Maho Maho especially is very focused on trying to mill out your opponent as quickly as possible. So she likes to have strategies where you're churning through your opponent's deck, causing a refresh, getting damage in that way. If you think about this once per game is not terribly far away from what you get with Salvage the Future. I mean, Salvage is a 15, so it is much higher. But again, that uses your piece as opposed to just a once per game action. And again, your opponent can choose to mitigate that to some regard, but it is the kind of thing that the best usage of resource denial is just to have a whole lot of it, to the point where if your opponent can no longer discard cards, or they don't want to pay enter because they need it for their growing their assists, or maybe even their center, if that's a situation. Basically, you're trying to corner your opponent as much as you can with Maho Maho and try to put them in a really bad situation, really force them to make a mistake, and then just kind of clean up after that. Finally, here we have Yuka Yuka. She has an auto effect that whenever a Signee on your opponent's field attacks, that Signee loses its abilities until end of turn unless your opponent pays 1 colorless. So this is an effect that really can shut down attackers if your opponent relies on effects like Assassin or Lancer, or if they have attack phase timing removal, which we all know is very powerful and extremely effective. It's a way that taxes them to basically force them to pay an extra enter in order for those things to trigger, or they just don't get usage out of them. So this is a little bit more on the enter denial side, whereas like Maho Maho was deck destruction, Mikomiko was hand management, hand destruction type of thing. This is more about controlling your opponent's enter. She does have an enter effect as well to return target Signee on your opponent's field to its owner's hand. So again, hand returning abilities to basically bounce your opponent's Signee are pretty powerful because not only does that open a lane, it does deny them some enter as well. So that is sort of on par with what she's already doing. She also has a once per game ability to do the following 3 times. Unless your opponent discards a card or pays 1 colorless, you look at the top 3 cards of your deck, add up to 1 card from among them to your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So a little bit of a mouthful, but the short version is your opponent chooses to either discard a card or pay 1, or if they don't do either of those things, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, pick 1, and add it to your hand. So again, with these choose multiples, especially when your opponent is choosing, you're going to get the worst one unless they can't afford it or choose not to. I mean, sometimes they just don't want to pay the enter. Sometimes they really need the cards in their hand. But this is potentially a super draw 3, where you're getting 3 extremely good cards. You know, basically the best of the 3 cards 3 different times. So it can really refill your hand and kind of accelerate you to setting up a really powerful board state. But again, you're forcing the choice on your opponent, and you're not always going to get what you want, which is a little bit of a problem. But I think it's powerful enough that it does have some validity to it. You'll just have to keep that in mind that you probably won't always get exactly what you want. You just kind of have to be happy with the choices that you have in front of you. Moving on to the assists, we're going to look at Yuka first. The level 1 that I've chosen here is Yuka Pawn. Her enter effect, it's free to grow. Look at the top 3 cards of your deck, reveal up to 2 cards without a guard from among them, and add them to your hand. So kind of like the traditional draw 2 type situation. When white level 1s have this effect, they're usually choosing, which I mean we have here as well. The only bad part is that you can't get guards off of this. I would say in most situations I would rather just have a straight draw 2, just for the fact that you can potentially pull guards out of it. But you know, potentially picking 2 out of 3 is not bad. It's a perfectly acceptable level 1, I think. For level 2s, I'd like to look at Zubaba, which is attack face timing 2 to grow. Enter effect, your opponent can only have up to 2 Signee on their field this turn. If they already have more, they must basically trash Signee until they have 2. So this is a very interesting effect. It's lane control, it's removal in a way, but it's better than removal because it's a trash effect, so that doesn't go to enter. The downside here is your opponent chooses, so it's not always going to be meaningful removal. I mean, if there's a situation where there's a lane that's not open, they're just going to choose that one anyway. You can also potentially use this to open up a lane on your own main phase if you wanted to. It's not always the best option. You usually want to have this attack phase timing, but this is a little harder because you can't necessarily count on this as a defensive option, but it is nice to have. Additionally, there's a second effect to pay a white and 1 to add a Signee with a guard from your trash to your hand, so that is extremely useful. Recurring guards is something that's relatively uncommon. The fact that she comes with it is always nice to have. It's a little expensive for that case. I mean, it'll be a total of 4 to get there, but it's just a nice to have, I think. My personal favorite of her level 2s is Boo Boo. It's 3 to grow. Target Signee on your opponent's field gains a constant ability that the Signee cannot attack until end of turn unless your opponent discards 3 cards. There's a second enter effect that is the same thing, that the Signee cannot attack unless your opponent pays 3 enter. And then additionally, you can pay a white and 2 more colorless to basically give a third instance of target Signee cannot attack until end of turn. And this one is your choice. Your opponent doesn't have the choice with that. So this really fits the theme of Kyurukyurun in general, where your opponent is you can essentially shut down an entire board here for 6 energy that none of your Signee can attack, but that's assuming that your opponent doesn't discard the 3 and doesn't pay the 3. So the fact that they have choices makes this a little more limited. Obviously, it can potentially be very expensive to basically, if you only have 1 or 2 life cloth that you need to save, you basically need to pay the full 3, and even then your opponent can still potentially get around that. It is worth noting here that if that is the case, like say your opponent has 1 really strong double crush Signee type of thing, you actually can stack all of these effects on 1 Signee if you wanted. So basically, if you want to really prevent one thing from attacking, you can force your opponent to discard 3 and pay 3 in order for that 1 Signee to attack, if like that's the only open lane, for instance. So it can really shut something down. Again, you can also pay the full 6 and just get that outright. So I would say in a worst case scenario, if you do pay the 6, you'll probably stop 2 attacks off of it, which isn't bad, but it's a little expensive. As with most things, and again, I'm repeating myself here, but the fact that your opponent chooses what the outcomes are makes this a little harder to use. But the taxing effects on this, discarding 3 cards is an enormous payment. Some decks can pay it easily, some decks can never hope to pay it. And the same thing with the enter. There are some decks that generate a lot of enter that they're like, sure, 3 is nothing, and there's some decks that really could never possibly pay it. So it's going to depend on the matchup. But again, just an interesting card, and it really forces your opponent to make some very difficult decisions. For Maho Maho, the level 1 that I like is Jajan, which is a pretty straightforward level 1 black assist Elrig. Target Signee on your opponent's field gets minus 8,000 power until end of turn. There is another one of these where you can give target Signee minus 12,000 unless your opponent pays 1. So again, trying to avoid as much of that as possible and putting some control back in the hands of the Kyurukyurun player. I really prefer this one. Usually the level 1 assists are more designed for removing level 1 or maybe level 2 Signee anyway. So the fact that your opponent can potentially turn off that removal, to me, is I'd rather just have the removal. You can kind of, if you wanted to build a deck around it, I can see situations where you use that one and just try to tax your opponent, basically maybe trick them into paying more enter, and then by the time that your other taxing effects come into play, they just run out of steam, and you kind of overwhelm them that way. So my personal favorite Maho Maho assist is Dagon, which is it's 1 to grow. You can pay 3 extra enter to add up to 2 target Signee without a guard from your trash to your hand. I think recurring cards in general in this game is very powerful because not only you can use them as Signee, and then when they get vanished, they go to enter, and then back to the graveyard when you use that enter. Because you could even pay the 3, whatever's stuck in your enter, you pay that 3, and then just bring those cards immediately back to your hand, which is really nice. There is also an enter effect that a target Signee on your opponent's field gets minus 3,000 power until end of turn for every card in your hand. So this is something that does rely on having a lot of cards in hand. But just the deck in general is pretty good at drawing a lot of cards and keeping that hand advantage up, especially if you have Mikomiko center. So that's not the end of the world. If you do pay the full 4, you're going to have at least 2 cards. So that's at minus 6k at least, which can potentially hit something. But I would say it's feasible to have 9 to 12, maybe even 15k power reduction to just remove one thing off the board. So not terrible for that kind of rate, especially if you don't need, if you already have those cards in your hand and you're just paying the 1 to get potentially a minus 12k or minus 15 at attack phase timing. That's a pretty good rate. So definitely something that's worth looking into. I do want to mention Zudodon here as an option. It's a unique assist. This is not the kind of thing that we've seen really very often, if at all. I don't think we have something like this. There is no effect at all. It's just an auto effect that at the beginning of your attack phase, you put the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck into their trash. So again, more about resource denial. If you do want to get into the deck destruction part of it and reduce your opponent's deck and do some damage through refreshes, Zudodon is a really interesting option to build a deck around. I don't know that I do that in a Kyurukyurun deck specifically, but I can definitely see a Dream Team deck where that is the kind of theme. If I were to use that type of stuff with Kyurukyurun, I feel like Maho Maho Center is better at just doing that. But this specific assist has some really interesting ideas in terms of usability. I think in the future, and especially off team, I think there are a lot of really interesting ways to take advantage of that effect. So finally, we'll talk about Mikomiko assists. Do keep in mind that these assists are not out yet. They will be coming out in P07, so not the next set, but the one after it if you're watching this as it comes out. If you are watching this in the future, then definitely feel free to look into it, because I think Mikomiko, of the other Kyurukyurun characters, I think Mikomiko has the most interesting assists, not even just within the team, but just in general. I think she's a pretty good assist character, so there's a lot of really interesting options she brings to the table. The first one we're going to talk about is Gachan. She is a 0 to grow, just main phase timing, real simple enter effect to put target level 1 Signee on your opponent's field to the bottom of its owner's deck. Again, pretty common for level 1 is just to remove one thing off the board for free. This one's very interesting because it puts it on the bottom of the deck. So it's similar to resource denial type stuff where you'd see maybe like removing things back to hand, like you'd see in Ange, is pretty common. The fact this one goes back to the deck is not only enter denial that you're not vanishing it, but it's also hand denial that you're just losing that card. It's offset by the fact that it's just level 1. But if you are a fan of the series or even the game in general, when I talked about Deus Ex Machina, having this restricted to just level 1s is not really a big deal. I mean, you're always going to have level 1s on the board to target for this. So if all you need is an open lane, you're going to get the open lane and you're going to get the resource denial that comes along with it. This is a very powerful level 1 assist, and it's something that's always worth using. So the fact that there is a second level 1 that I want to talk about, obviously that should be very interesting just because Gachan is already a really good level 1 assist. This one is Kyurukyurun. It's a level 1 assist, main phase and attack phase timing. So it's unique that there's not a lot of level 1 assists that have attack phase timing, but this one does. So that's already makes it very interesting to talk about. The enter effect is to draw 3 cards and discard 2 cards. If one or more cards were moved from your hand to the trash by your opponent's effect this turn, instead you draw 5 and discard 2. So if you're going up against any kind of discard heavy deck, anything that's really messing with your hand, you can play this on attack phase timing during your opponent's turn, and it's like a substantially better Xenocluster, really, because if you have Xenocluster to use that, you can use Xenocluster to draw 3 cards if you've discarded a card, basically. This one will draw you 5. You'll have to discard 2, but I mean, getting basically the best 3 out of the top 5 cards of your deck. Additionally, I mean, it doesn't affect, you can discard cards that are already in your hand. So if you're in a situation where maybe your opponent discarded one of your cards, you still have 2 cards left. You can play this during their turn, draw up to 7, and then just discard the 2 worst cards in your hand, which could be the 2 cards that you had already. Maybe the 2 cards you had were just useless. So extremely good for card advantage. This is a very potent card, especially if you're against a meta or decks that, if your deck struggles against hand destruction, this is an extremely powerful way to fight back. And it's just a level 1 assist, and it's completely free to grow. So it doesn't do anything for lane removal, but the hand advantage you get from this card is it's already pretty good, even if you just get the draw 3, discard 2. But it's still, I mean, it can potentially be a blowout card against certain decks. The level 2 assist that I'd like to talk about for Mikomiko is Zubashan. It is 3 to grow. It does have attack phase and main phase timing. The enter effect is to put target Signee on your opponent's field to the bottom of its owner's deck. So again, clearing a lane, card denial because it goes to the bottom of the deck as opposed to back in the hand, enter denial because you're not vanishing it, it's not sending it to enter. There's a second enter effect to discard 3 cards, and then you can look at your opponent's hand, choose a card from it, and they discard it. So it kind of plays along with Kyurukyurun, which is the second one that I talked about, where if you have all of these extra cards, I mean, if you're drawing 5 cards from your assist and discarding 2, which is +3, you can potentially have a big hand, and then you can use some of those options in your hand to force your opponent to discard the best card in their hand. So it's 3 to grow for a removal effect, which is a little expensive, but the fact that you have the option to, again, remove the best card in your opponent's hand, which in a lot of cases can just be a guard. The Kyurukyurun in general is more of an attrition-based deck, so filtering out and avoiding as many guards as you can is a huge deal. The fact that you can basically go in your opponent's hand and say, oh, there's a guard in there, and just get rid of it. It's a way to continue to push more damage as the game continues to unfold. The last thing I'd like to mention is we always talk about team-specific Signee. As with all of the other teams, Kyurukyurun does have a team-focused Signee, so it's worth mentioning. It's certainly not as strong as some of the other team Signee, but it kind of goes along with what they're already doing, so it's just something to keep in mind as you're building your decks. It's Honey to Ice, Code Order. It has an auto effect at the beginning of your opponent's turn. If your opponent has 2 or more cards in their hand, they can only draw 1 card total during the draw phase. So it punishes your opponents for having a big hand. If you're already kind of discarding and hand denying them enough, this may not really do anything. If they only have 1 card in hand, for example, it literally does nothing. But again, it's ways to just keep your opponent slowly whittling down their resources. Going from 2 to 1 cards per turn is a huge disadvantage. So if you can keep this on the field, and if you can keep them from drawing extra cards per turn, that can really add up over time. It also has an auto effect at the beginning of your attack phase. Each player draws a card, then you look at your opponent's hand, choose a card without a guard, and put it on the bottom of its owner's deck. So again, more hand destruction. It's also important too that you can actually see what cards are in your opponent's hand. You're not able to get rid of guards, obviously, which is a big downside, but the fact that you can potentially set up your plays for the next couple of turns if you're in a situation where your opponent has a really powerful level 3 that they may be coming back with on their turn, you can kind of slow it down and get rid of it. And again, just denying more resources. The more cards you can get rid of, the better. It does draw them a card, so it leaves them card neutral, kind of, but it also draws you a card. So overall, it's +1 in terms of card advantage because you're drawing one, your opponent's drawing one, and discarding one in a way. It's not a strict discard; it goes to the bottom of the deck. But it's a way to again just slowly accumulate this resource advantage over time, and hopefully by the end of it, just try to outlast your opponent. And with all that, we have Kyurukyurun in a nutshell. So there's a lot of things going on. The nice things about this team in particular is they are very open-ended. They don't really restrict you to one specific strategy. You can kind of go hand denial with Mikomiko. You can go deck denial with Maho. You can go a little bit of enter denial with Yuka. If you want an enter denial specific deck, usually you run red for that, so that's not necessarily the best choice, but for building with this team, Yuka is not bad for that. But overall, there's a lot of really interesting things. Again, it doesn't really push you into one strategy. You can kind of be free to do whatever you want with it. I'm in the middle of brewing a deck with this, at least for now, that is a Cosmos deck, because all the best Cosmos cards tend to be in white, black, and blue. There's a few red ones that are pretty good too, but most of the best ones are in these three colors, so you can kind of build that way. It doesn't necessarily steer you to a specific build, so you have a lot of freedom. The fact that their piece, again, doesn't really affect you at all. I mean, their piece is purely an anti-opponent piece card. So it really doesn't determine anything you want to do with your deck. There's a lot of freedom in terms of deck building, which is mostly why I focused on the Elrigs here as opposed to the Signee, because you can really just build whatever you want with it and kind of just be reasonably successful. There's enough denial options to really keep your opponents on their toes. It's very interactive, so if you like interacting with your opponents and forcing them into weird and bad decisions, that's something that may be for you. If you don't like that, if you like to kind of do your own thing and head down and just kind of focus on your own strategy, this may not be the team for you. It's a little bit more advanced as well, just in terms of strategic decisions. Because as I mentioned, not only for you but also for your opponent, it's not always obvious what the best choices are. If you need to, if your opponent is discarding cards and removing enter to stop your grow effects, that type of thing. It's just a lot of options that there's a lot of unknowns that go into playing this deck, and for some people they don't like it. For some people that's extremely fun. So hopefully it's something worth checking out. If you like the video, it's maybe something to look at in the future. As I mentioned before, this is the final video. There are no teams left, so if you do want a dream team analysis and potentially constructing your team video, that's something I've thought about in the future making, once Welcome Back Diva starts getting close or is released. So I maybe end up doing that. If you'd like to see it, then definitely let me know. That'd be nice to get some encouragement from that. But otherwise, as always, thanks for watching.